Hey, everybody. This presentation is going to focus on additional factors of second language acquisition. So building upon the ideas from the previous presentation where we were looking at factors of language acquisition, there's a few additional things that I would like to share with you and discuss. So I will cover a couple of topics in this presentation. We'll talk about the PRISM model that looks at individual learner characteristics and how this impacts language acquisition. Then we'll look at stages of language development and how they're characterized. And then I want to share with you a topic called funds of knowledge and how that applies to your learners and how you can tap into these in your teaching. So let's get started. So first, just to kind of trigger some thinking before you get started with this presentation. The last PowerPoint, the last presentation when we were together, we looked at factors related to second language acquisition like motivation, the effective filter in the classroom, characteristics of comprehensible input. So just start to think what might be some additional factors that would play a role in your students' success in acquiring English as a second language and list those factors. Because you might have a classroom and some students are kind of getting 90% of what you're teaching, whereas some students might be getting 40% or even less, 20%. So what's going on internally for these other learners? And then how, as teachers, do we adjust our instruction so that we can scaffold appropriately for all of our learners? Okay, so let's start with this PRISM model. This comes out of the work of Thomas and Collier, who are real leaders in this field. And the whole point of this PRISM model is for you to understand that language acquisition does not occur in isolation. It's not simply, the learner studies this information about language and is able to output it. We know, just like any content, there's so much else going on with our learners. And so if you take a look at this prism and just thinking about how like light would refract through a prism, it's similar here. Their success, their acquisition of language is going to be the culminating effect of multiple factors, not just one factor. And at the heart of it, in the very center, are social and cultural processes. And we'll talk about each of these. This is kind of what's going on in the lives of our learners at home, at school, in society. But then there's also along this side is not only development in the second language, in our case, English, but also development in their first language. Are they continuing to speak this language? Are they continuing to learn to read and write in their home language at home? Is it encouraged by the school and valued by the school? And then also keep in mind that our learners, whether they're adult or children, they're not just learning language, they're also learning new content. We're always learning about the world around us, and more so for our younger learners who are engaged in classes related to content, science, history, English language arts, mathematics, etc. So that's also going on simultaneously. And then finally, cognitively, all of our learners, even adults, continue to improve in their ability to have metacognition, think about their thinking, right? Think about their learning, problem solving, critical thinking, memory, all of that cognitive development is also ongoing. I would add to this some contemporary new extensions in research that we are exploring, things like translanguaging. This is a really hot topic in second language acquisition studies now, where teachers are more and more using the home language in the classroom to facilitate language of the target language. And again, in our case, English. Looking at issues of identity and investment of funds of knowledge, which we will talk about here shortly. Also critical literacy, just in terms of helping the learner think about who is represented and who is not represented in the texts that we're reading or the texts around us, reading the world, language ideologies, and then also just refugee or immigrant or migrant experiences. And so just to focus a little bit more on that primary thing that's going on, social cultural processes, some of them that you want to be aware of, depending upon the context in which you find yourself teaching, is language use at school. Is there, if we're talking about young learners in the United States, are there people here in their schooling or that can speak their L1, that maybe a secretary that welcomes them in their home language, or an assistant teacher or a classroom teacher or a principal. What kind of status does that home language have at that school? Socioeconomic status of our learners. We know that poverty plays a role in learning, right? And our immigrant and minorities are at a higher risk for a lower socioeconomic status. So that's definitely a factor. And of course, we want to make sure that our learners are having their basic needs met before we can assume that they're going to be learning in the classroom. Past schooling, it's important to understand if there's been gaps in the students' learning, or, was there a break? Maybe they only attended formal schooling for a number of years in their home country due to different circumstances, or maybe they were in refugee camps where, access to schooling would have been perhaps varied, right? So it's important to understand what they're coming from and their relationship with schooling and learning in general. Their time in residence. So we know that it takes, 5 to 7 years fully immersed in a setting to become proficient in that language. 3 to 5 years for just developing that social language, being able to communicate with peers about, peer-to-peer relationships, but not content-based language. So, that's an important consideration to have, how long have they been immersed in English, if at all? Affective factors is huge, right? The psychological well-being of your learners, their mental health, their socioeconomic status, their home environment, the classroom environment, that of course you can help control to a certain extent. Their experience and perception of acceptance for their culture and language, and how that affects their outlook and behaviors, right? So all of this has a major impact on their language acquisition, speed and level. And then finally, societal factors. Sometimes people think that schools are immune to what's going on around them in society. And we know from research that it's quite the opposite, that actually what is going on in society definitely impacts directly what's going on with our learners inside the classroom. So they do not leave all of that at the doorstep of your classroom. They carry that with them. So what is your learner facing in their home context, right? So if you're teaching here in the US, it's obviously going to be a very different situation than if you're teaching English in that home country of the language that people speak, right? So if you were going abroad, let's say to South Korea and teaching English, that would be a different experience than the experience of teaching English here in the United States, where immigrants, based upon political circumstances, may or may not be, encountering inclusion, and might instead be facing oppression or discrimination. Okay. Okay, so stages of language development. It's also really important to get a sense of where your learners are as they enter your classroom. Hopefully, where you end up teaching will have language proficiency exams in place that will help you get this information. But it is not always that way. I know when I've done some community teaching, the students were tested, but even so, there was a wide variety of not only the number of times students had taken that level of class, but also just their proficiency levels within that level. So even, when there are tests, don't always assume that you're going to know where your students are. So, setting up some time, some individual interviews with students can be really important and helpful in understanding their needs and their strengths. I know when I was teaching the academic learners here at NC State in the English conversation classes and also academic writing and research classes, I met with them during those first 2 weeks of class just to get a baseline of not only their language, but also their motivations and their goals academically. And I found that the semesters when I did that work, we were more successful in terms of creating individual goals and me supporting them, especially when I realized that early on more scaffolding was needed for their help, especially in writing. So with that in mind, no matter what level you're teaching at, you're going to find out if your students are at this entering phase. And if they are, this is a really important time to allow silence. It's really imperative that you understand that even if students are really quiet or reserved or not providing a lot of output, that does not mean that they are not listening, attending, and acquiring language. That's going on even if they're not ready to output. So we don't want to pressure them. This is a time that I want you to think about exploration. They're exploring language during this time. As they move into emerging, they're starting to connect. They're starting to make connections between maybe their first language and this new language with English. Um, Maybe they're starting to have level, like word level utterances, right? Or being able to connect photos with words. So that's kind of the connection. That's where they're starting to make connections. Developing stage is when they're starting to express. So we might have short phrases, short sentences, might be some individual expression here in the developing stage. And then the last three, expanding, bridging, and reaching, are really as they're starting to develop their language proficiency and flexibility. In expanding, I want you to think about elaborating, being able to better describe their needs and operate in different contexts. Bridging, they're integrating their experiences, and navigating is really when they are moving on to this lifelong language learning status. And so just remember that these stages of language are ongoing and change is continuous, but certainly gradual. And you'll remember from our previous presentation that it is also slow. We know that this can take years of full-time dedication, 5 to 7 years. If you think about children who are in the public school day, from 8 to 3, Monday through Friday. And if you're teaching adults, they don't usually have that luxury of spending so many hours on language development. So just thinking about how slow this process can be. Okay, just a quick myth buster, just to remind you that remembering the interdependence between first language and second language. So our learners, if you go back to that PRISM, we want them to continue to develop their language in their first language. We want them to continue to develop academically, content-wise in their first language, and cognitively. This does not go against the learning of English. It actually supports it. And if you can do this, like in this drawing where English and Spanish at the same time, right, that bilingual mind is much more flexible and much more powerful than than we might give it credit for. So just reflecting, how can you as a teacher of English also support your students' continuing development of their first language? This is a different conversation if you are teaching in the US versus if you are teaching abroad, right, in another context. Teaching here in the US, I think that this is maybe bears more importance because people who have migrated to the US or to any English dominant country, right, Australia, England, et cetera, they might see their home language as being maybe a lesser valued language and not realize the important cognitive, academic, and language development that they need to continue in that L1. So your role as teacher is to really encourage that, value it, acknowledge it, use it in the classroom when possible, right? And just really emphasize that importance of it. Meanwhile, if you're teaching abroad, it's a different conversation, right? They are immersed in their L1 still. So it's a very different context. They're not having to learn English as like a survival language. So it's not as important. Okay, so same thing here with the second question. All right, so I want to talk about funds of knowledge. One of my favorite topics. This is an area that I have done a lot of research in and worked extensively in since completing my doctoral work, so a number of years. But funds of knowledge is just essentially, it came out of the work of actually an anthropologist and some classroom teachers. But the important thing is that, funds of knowledge really pushes back against deficit perspectives of migrants, immigrants, refugee learners as saying, hey, wait a minute, even though they're developing this language, it doesn't mean that they don't bring other knowledge to the classroom and saying, okay, what is that knowledge? What background knowledge do they have? And then is there a way that we could tap into that, right? Access that so that the language learning becomes more meaningful? Because if your students can be moved from, viewing themselves as assets, right? Being experts on something and not like these, if you've ever studied a language, sometimes you feel like I'm stuck in a baby's mind in this language, right? No, but you also bring all this experience and knowledge that we want to be able to access. Okay, so as it says here, this was developed by Louis Mall with his work with Kathy Amonte, Deborah Neff, and Norma Gonzalez. And they started visiting homes in the class near the classrooms where they were teaching in Tucson, Arizona. And the whole purpose of this work was to develop innovations in teaching that draw upon the knowledge and skills that they found, this tremendous knowledge in the households of their students. Okay, so what are they? They're these historically accumulated and culturally developed bodies of knowledge, a fancy way of saying background knowledge. So what is it that your learners bring to the classroom? And I'll just speak from personal experience, which I share in a couple slides, but I was teaching, I think the unit was on health and remedies, and oh my goodness, it came out of nowhere, all the knowledge that my students held. Some of them were doctors, nurses, neurologists in their home country. They had tremendous knowledge about not only health problems, but health remedies, and were eager to talk about it and to understand how to express things in this new language in English. So that was just one area where I kind of accidentally tapped into it. But being able to be aware of the knowledge that your students bring to the classroom and then design lessons with that in mind can be very powerful. So just thinking about, do your students have knowledge about agriculture, mining? Do they have knowledge about economics? Economics, household management? Do they have knowledge about material and scientific knowledge like construction, repair? Do they have knowledge of medicine, folk medicine? Do they have knowledge of religion? I find a lot of my students have deep knowledge of religion that they can draw on. And so just thinking about some of your family's funds of knowledge. I know for my particular family, we've got deep knowledge of fishing and types of lures and flies for particular fishing and where to fish and how to fish. We also have extensive knowledge about soccer and reading the game and preparing and playing and all of that, as well as gardening and converting kind of like grass into natural areas for pollinators. So a lot of knowledge there. And what I found from my students, like I've mentioned, a lot of religious knowledge, extensive knowledge of the Bible or their holy book. Knowledge about baking. I had a student bake this beautiful cake with fondant and very elaborate icing and things that she was able to share with the classroom. Knitting, I had students have knitted like little animals and things that they have shared with the class. I had students who were really skilled in table tennis, and they were able to kind of convert that over to pickleball when we were playing that. So a lot of knowledge there. So I'm going to ask you just to think about your own or your family's funds of knowledge, because one thing I haven't mentioned is it's also perfectly fine for you to think about lessons that tap into your own passions and knowledge, because we're human. And as teachers, if we can talk about things and teach about things that we're also interested in personally, it just makes them more convincing, richer, a better experience. So like if you have extensive knowledge of music, talking about music, I remember I had a professor who was really into flamenco guitar, and he had learned how to play it and brought it into our class and played some music. And then we looked at the poetry, the lyrics of those songs as a form of poetry. That's an example. So whatever it is that really, lights you up, think about, can I incorporate that into my teaching? I've had students who are really into like beekeeping that talked all about bees, planting like little container gardens and talking about different types of plants and pollinators and parts of plants. Whatever it is that's really your passion, you want to try to tap into that. And that's the same that goes for your students. You can imagine how much more interested they will be to share their knowledge. Okay. And so you can read this quote. I'll give you a moment. Mhm. And so just kind of, again, pushing back on that idea that, people who don't speak English are somehow, especially here in the United States, disorganized socially, deficient intellectually, that deficit perspective, and saying, wow, actually, they contain ample cultural and cognitive resources that really has good use for classroom instruction, and we're going to tap into those. And so just being aware of that and thoughtful about our lesson planning. Okay. And again, it's the idea that the learners get shifted from like being stuck in this baby's language to experts in the classroom. And students can express personal messages that they already want to express and have knowledge to build from, right? Well, how can we learn about our students' funds of knowledge? Because you might be saying, well, yeah, this all sounds good, but how do I know like what knowledge they have? Well, like I'm doing for you, I'm asking you. You can certainly survey your students at the beginning of the semester, the beginning of the year. A lot of informal conversations can reveal some of this information. Looking at pictures seems like that really shares a lot of information. You can see things that they're doing in those pictures or places they're visiting. Even just asking students about what they did over the weekend can sometimes reveal some of these background skills and expertise. We can ask them to create photo stories, which I'll share an example in a moment. You can go visit them at their home. You can ask them to make collages of pastimes, hobbies, interests that they have. You can go and attend cultural or public events in their communities. So something I'm thinking of like Fiesta del Pueblo is a big Latino festival that we have every year in Raleigh, and how you can learn about the diversity of Spanish speakers in our community, and see things that they sell, foods they make, etc., and really learn a lot about them in that process. Or you could, instead of going out to the community, you could bring the community into your classroom by inviting, guest speakers, people from various backgrounds to come and share their expertise with the class. This is just one quick example that my son did, but this stuffed animal, especially if you're working with younger learners, went home with him over the weekend, and his task was to take pictures of what that stuffed animal was doing with him over the weekend, and then to write a story about Busy Bees weekend. So just thinking through, like, how can I learn more about what goes on for my learner at their house without just asking them? Can be a really effective way. I think I've shared these examples where students have a lot of knowledge about home remedies, and you could ask them to bring supplies or photos of what they do, to treat the cold or treat the flu or to treat other ailments. And then one other thing that I've done that's been very effective is a how-to unit where, students have so much knowledge, right, about everything. And so I asked them to design something that they were an expert about and to teach us how to do it. And it's an interactive demonstration. So we've learned how to dance particular dances. We've learned how to make foods from cultures. We've learned how to play instruments. Just so many ways to use language to share something that's interesting and passionate for them. These were just a couple of examples I've had from the past where there was a student, this was a middle school learner that I had, that he became this expert in a after school club because they were trying to create birdhouses. And so he brought in a picture of a house that he had built with his father and was an expert with tools and construction. And it really changed how he was seen in the classroom, not only for himself, but with his classmates as well. Okay, so that is the end of this part of our presentation. And I hope that you learned something new about second language acquisition and additional factors that might affect your learners. And I look forward to continuing this conversation and talking more with you about language acquisition. See you next time. Bye-bye.